Joining me now, Professor Robert Patman from Otago University. Thank you very much for joining me, Professor.
Oh, you're welcome,
How's the
Paul.
weather down there? Have you got snow?
Bit murky, but chilly. I flew in this morning from Wellington. I was in Wellington yesterday, and a distinct drop in temperature.
Oh, I bet. Did you
Yeah,
feel the earthquake today?
I didn't, but yeah, I thought it was just the building moving. No, I didn't feel it.
It's probably not a bad thing. I don't like earthquakes, not at all. Hey, the big news this week in terms of anything international was obviously the presidential debate that happened between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Um, while I've been seeing a million memes about the Simpsons and dogs and cats being fearful for their lives in Springfield, I'm kind of curious what your impressions were of the whole thing.
Well, I think my impressions were probably not too different from many other people. I thought that Kamala Harris, I think she had a good night. One thing that struck me immediately was I think she prepared thoroughly for the occasion. And you could see that her legal background played a role in the finesse and polish of her performance. The other thing was that psychologically, she took the initiative immediately by striding across the podium and shaking quite vigorously Donald Trump's hands and wishing him a good debate. And I think she was quickly taking the initiative and, to use the boxing phrase, closing down the ring. She was making sure that she was not going to be dictated to by Mr. Trump. And the interesting thing was that she planted a series of little barbs in her comments and responses to questions, which really got under Mr. Trump's skin. And I think from his point of view, and those of his supporters and his team, he would, to use an American phrase, he spent a lot of his time off message. He spent a lot of time responding to provocations which were planted by Kamala Harris precisely for that reason. So he didn't just bite on the bait; he swallowed it hook, line, and sinker.
And I heard today he's decided not to do another debate with her.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. I mean, from Mr. Trump's point of view, it must have been a difficult experience. Kamala Harris was not at all intimidated. In fact, that's the most confident performance I've seen by any politician in a debate with Trump, including when he ran for, and he had a whole series of debates when he was running in 2016 to get the Republican nomination. I thought this was an extremely good performance by Kamala Harris. It probably wasn't as forthcoming as we would have liked to have heard about her plans, but I think she did enough to get, in boxing terms, a points victory rather than a knockout blow. But to me, the concluding statements would summarize the difference between the two candidates on the night. Mr. Trump was still devoted his vision statement, the last part of the evening, to defending himself, to responding. And so that was a wasted opportunity to set out exactly his vision for America in the next 4 years. So, yeah, I mean, I look, we've got to keep these debates in perspective, Paul. I think his base, which is probably 40% of voters in the United States, or close to that, between 30 and 40, will not be moved or put off by how he performed. They will probably see his performance as vindication of their support for him. The crucial constituency here, though, is the uncommitted voters in the middle, the ones who may vote instrumentally, either for the Republicans or for the Democrats. And I don't think he did anything to really win them over in that debate. But it's a long way to go. 8 weeks, as one politician once said famously many years ago, a week is a long way. A week is a long time in politics, and we've got 8 more of them. So a lot can happen.
How do you think a win for either of the candidates would impact us? What is it that they bring to the table that's going to have an impact to us here in the South Pacific?
Well, I think there were some signs of that during the debate. Actually, if you take the issue of Ukraine, although we've been not slow, but perhaps we've been measured in recognizing it, Ukraine is a crucial issue for New Zealand. New Zealand's a small country which trades with 100 countries, more than 100 countries around the world. And to do that, it relies critically on rules and procedures which everyone observes. Because being relatively weak, we need rules. Um, if when the Ukraine subject came up, Mr. Trump was invited to say whether he would support Ukraine through to victory. Would he back Ukraine winning that conflict? He twice declined to answer that question and just said he'd bring peace within 24 hours. Now, that's a slightly alarming signal to New Zealand, because if Mr. Trump's peace involves a land for peace deal between, which, in other words, that Mr. Putin largely keeps the land that he's illegally seized from Ukraine, that's destabilizing globally, particularly for countries, middle and small powers like ours. So I think you could say from that Miss uh, Kamala Harris's answer to the question, yes, she did support Ukraine ejecting Russian troops from the country, and yes, she did support the re-establishment of internationally recognised borders as opposed to those defined by Russia, was much more comforting to New Zealand than that provided by Mr. Trump. So one big difference, I think, is that I think New Zealand will probably feel more comfortable, given its international interests, with a Harris victory rather than a Trump victory.
Does that also include things like economic outlooks? I know Trump's making a big deal about introducing tariffs. America is largest, second largest trading partner sort of out there in the world.
Well, yes. I mean, I think Mr. Trump is quite committed to imposing across the board tariffs, isn't he, on exporters to the United States. So that will, by the way, that's likely to disadvantage a lot of American families. Um, so I'm not quite sure he'll pull that one off. The devil is in the detail with that, and I think it could be economically and politically counterproductive. But that, putting it to one side, if he follows through with that promise, that's not good news for New Zealand, or many other countries exporting to the United States. Um, I don't think, apart from the pledge to introduce those sort of tariffs, I don't think there'll be enormous difference between a Harris and Trump administration. I wouldn't expect, for example, a tremendous difference between those two possible administrations and their respective policies towards China. It seems to me there's one thing that seems to unite many an otherwise divided America, and that is the perception that China is a serious threat to American primacy in the world. Therefore, I think that both the a future Harris administration and a future Trump administration would probably intensify the competition with China rather than diminish it.
Do we as a country really understand the implications of how this election is going to impact us?
I think I think we've got a reasonably shrewd idea. Um, I think first of all, we can't expect dramatic differences in relation to China, our biggest trade partner. Um, I think if Mr. Trump becomes the president, he wins the election, I think uh, that will not only complicate perhaps our economic relationship with the United States, but I think it would also, to some degree, make our position with respect to China. We've threaded this delicate position with respect to China. We've got a free trade agreement with China. It's our biggest trade export destination by a long way. It could complicate our situation there. So I think we are reasonably aware of that. AUKUS is another issue. If Trump becomes president, I can't see, it'll be very difficult for the coalition government, I think, to follow through closer alignment with an America First Trump administration. And indeed, when I was in Australia last year, someone who's remained unnamed, a senior military official, said to me, actually, if Mr. Trump becomes president, AUKUS itself becomes problematic, because in Australia's case, they're largely paying for it. But also, the idea that you have someone leading that enhanced security arrangement which is designed to deter China, um, if it was being led by someone who doesn't really believe in multilateral cooperation, and you're paying for that, that's probably um, something the Australians won't want to accept. I just think it will be very difficult politically for Chris Luxon-led government to be able to politically sell a closer alignment with a Trump administration. Most Kiwis, right across the board, I don't think it's just on the middle or the set left, but on the right, there's a fair degree of skepticism about Mr. Trump's international America first position. So I think that could, I think there's awareness there. So I think on China, AUKUS, relations with the Pacific, that's an interesting one. That's a very important area for New Zealand, both in terms of people-to-people ties. Also, Maori in this country consider themselves, emphasize the Pacific identity of their people, and that has contributed to a tightening relationship with the Pacific. I think on balance, we'd probably prefer a Harris administration to a Trump one with regard to that issue. But, some of these foreign policy issues, it's difficult to predict in advance because Harris has been she's been an incumbent as vice president, but at the same time, it's largely a ceremonial role. So she may turn out to be quite differently to how we expect, where if and when she if she wins the election and when she gets that position as president as a result. So it wouldn't surprise me if Harris turned out to pursue quite different policies than we expect if she gets the top job. But they're neck and neck at the moment. So Mr. Trump's got a very good chance of making it back to the White House.
I was going to say that's one of the other questions that we've had pop up is are you able to explain how that's even possible? Since New Zealanders sort of sit back and look at Trump and go, how is this the best that you can do? And the polls are so incredibly close. It's the kind of thing I think New Zealanders don't really understand how it could happen.
No, it is a difficult thing to comprehend outside the United States, and for some Americans, difficult to comprehend within. I was very taken by, or struck, I should say, by an observation made after the first Biden-Trump debate by a Washington Post observer who said he or she had watched, it was a she actually, had watched 12 presidential debates in her career. It was the first time that the clear winner, which was Mr. Trump, had emerged having not answered a single question and coherently lied throughout the whole thing. She could never remember a winner on that basis. And she was, the person was reflecting on the depths to which American politics has fallen. And certainly, if you watch the debates between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon in 1960, and certainly the first debate, and I suspect the second one, a huge decline in terms of political debate and discourse since then. So that's a bit of a sobering message, I think, for those of us who always assume as the years go by, everything gets better and better everywhere. It doesn't always work that way. It's very difficult to explain in that sense. But I think what we can say is that Mr. Trump has, I think, presented himself as someone who can run the economy. That in its term is contestable. By the time he left office, he had high levels of unemployment. He had substantially added to the budget deficit through his tax cuts, which didn't pay for themselves. But the Biden administration, although it's been relative, most economists give the Biden administration a pretty good rating, actually, because they've got unemployment to quite low levels. They've brought inflation down from about 9%, which is very high, down to about 2.5%. And they've got, record levels in the stock market. So on the face of it, you'd think many people will be happy, but they're not. And I think the reason is despite all those gains, for many American families, they compare the costs of living in 2024 with 2021 when Mr. Biden began his administration. And for many, and it's not just confined to the United States, we've seen here huge rises in the prices of food and groceries, same in the United States. I was reading something recently that many Americans believe their groceries bill alone is 20% more expensive in 2024 than it was in 2021. So I think that may have contributed to um, taking Mr. Trump seriously. Yeah, I mean, it's. I think the other thing was that I think Mr. Biden had, to some extent, inflated the Trump challenge because he was clearly, I think, and I don't mean this in an unpleasant way. I meant Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden was showing signs of frailty, and I think Americans felt he was a bit old for the job. And I think Mr. Trump came across as more vigorously. But interestingly, since Kamala Harris has got the presidential nomination, she has been steadily rising in the polls, and they're now neck and neck. But if the trajectory of the last month continues, she's likely to overtake Mr. Trump in the near future. And I don't think the debate, it may or may not change that trajectory, but certainly I don't think will halt it. But yeah, it's a difficult question for non-Americans to answer. I think it comes down to bread and butter things like cost of living. That Mr.
Fair enough.
Trump is still there with a very good shout.
Okay. Taylor Swift going to make a difference?
Well, I think it will do, given her huge following. So yeah, I mean, it's we political scientists often get bogged down with issues and particular policies, but a celebrity endorsement in the United States apparently counts for a lot. And somebody once said about America, "You're a celebrity if you're a celebrity." People take that sort of status very seriously, perhaps more seriously than they do countries like New Zealand. But yeah, Taylor Swift is top of her game and carries a lot of weight. And she not only endorsed Kamala Harris, but she made a very pointed comment, which she said she endorsed her as a childless, cat-loving woman, or words to that effect,
Yes.
which
Yeah, I
was a
saw
real
that.
barb at J.D. Vance, the vice president, who made very unflattering comments about women who are in that category. So I think that was throwing down the gauntlet. And the other thing is, just reflecting on the debate, Paul, I do think the most powerful part of the debate from Kamala Harris's point of view is when she got onto the abortion issue. The proposal of the Trump Vance team to constrict women's rights in that area. And I think even a lot of Republican women are very uncomfortable with that, what seems to be serious constraints on their bodily autonomy. So I think that's going to be. I think that issue is going to figure prominently. And what is bad news for Mr. Trump is that policy may have not been such a big issue when Mr. Biden was in the opposite corner, but with a woman of color, the first woman of color to head for the competing for the White House, and with quite a background on that issue, she was given responsibility within the Biden administration to take up that issue. I think that's a bit of a tactical setback for the Trump team.
Speaking of tactical setbacks, on a very different topic, how do we look overseas at the moment if we break our contracts by text message?
Well, it's not a good look, but every way you look at it, it looks a bit shoddy. At the very least, I think there should have been a face-to-face meeting with someone dispatched from Wellington to Seoul, and also even a Zoom meeting would have been preferable to a text message. Although I don't know the content of the text message, I do think it showed diplomatic naivety. It also showed, I think, an alarming lack of awareness about the way diplomacy is conducted in Asia, where mutual respect is a big deal. And so that doesn't smack of it. That seems like a very Western high tech approach to a problem, and I'm not sure it'll go down very well. And it's a shame because South Korea is a very important partner for New Zealand.
Yeah, I was going to say we've just had a tour over there. The Prime Minister's just been
Yeah,
there into other parts of Southeast Asia. Um, how do you think that's going so far? Like the PM has spent a lot of time out of the country this year, shaking hands and making sure that we've been seen. Is that making an impact?
I think so. I mean, to their credit, both Mr. Peters and increasingly Mr. Luxon. Mr. Peters made the running initially, but Mr. Luxon is now doing that. They both said they had two key foreign policy goals when they came in. One was to hustle and be more activist on the international stage and be present. Um, to be fair to the previous government, they were constrained by COVID-19 to some degree. And the second key objective they identified was tighter or closer alignment between New Zealand and its traditional allies. And they also seem to be moving in that direction as well. Although I think, for reasons we've already discussed, that objective is slightly hostage to events. One event, if Mr. Trump comes to power, that could complicate New Zealand's desire to be closer to the United States because under Mr. Trump, America doesn't look like the sort of traditional partner that many Kiwis imagine when the term traditional ally is conjured up. Another area, of course, as well as Mr. Trump, but Gaza has also thrown a long shadow. Um, America's willingness to unconditionally support Mr. Netanyahu's response to the appalling Hamas terrorist attack on the 7th of October has thrown up problems of its own and somewhat undercut the whole rationale for, say, joining AUKUS, because one of the official rationale for joining AUKUS is the perception that China is the major threat to the international rules-based order on which New Zealand depends, and therefore New Zealand should position itself closer to the US to contribute to that effort to deter China. That's been undercut by the fact that America hasn't walked the talk about upholding international rules in Gaza. At least that's the perception. And that has spillover effects for Gaza. In other words, it's now become much more difficult. And I know the government has said it hasn't made a decision about Pillar 2 of AUKUS, but it's now become much more difficult than it was, say, even 6 months ago for New Zealand to take that step to join Pillar 2 because of factors beyond its control, namely events in Gaza. So there are, in a sense, tighter alignment with traditional allies does also depend on events and the behaviour of some of those allies, and that's a dynamic factor. It's not set in stone. America is not the same country it was, say, even 20 years ago. So,
One of the other questions that actually came through was about that kind of relationship with America's policy and how we can influence policy in respect specifically to New Caledonia and West Papua.
yeah,
Um, the question is, does US policy influence our policy in respect to those places?
I think there is a suspicion it does. Um, one thing that really struck me, Paul, is that the Luxon Peters foreign policy team, if you want to call it that, because they've stressed tighter relations with the United States, they've sometimes withheld criticism of the United States on issues that matter to many Kiwis. And we've already mentioned one, Gaza. Uh, Luxon could, as a loyal ally, ask the United States to think again about the policy it was pursuing in supporting Mr. Netanyahu so comprehensively. It hasn't done that publicly. In the UN, of course, we've been pretty proactive in pushing for a ceasefire, and that's to the credit of the government. But I think you could argue that the government is trying to thread things very carefully so that its UN diplomacy in relation to Gaza is um, humanitarian and responsive to the appalling situation on the ground, but at the same time, not in a way that would provoke the United States. And I think that's possibly an influence that you could say. With regard to New Caledonia, Mr. Peters, I think, offered himself up as a mediator there. In a sense, I think there are some people in New Zealand who like to see the current New Zealand government being more critical of France over New Caledonia. They changed the goalposts over the voting, the eligibility for voting in New Caledonia, and that caused quite a violent reaction from from people who are associated with the Kanaks, the indigenous people. Let's be quite clear: France is the colonial power, and many Pacific Islanders, and I think people probably on the centre left in this country believe that New Zealand, because our founding document is the Treaty of Waitangi, which advocates cooperation between indigenous and people and the settler community, saying that we should be doing everything possible to accelerate decolonisation in New Caledonia. So there may be critics may say our concern to keep on side with France and the United States for reasons of great power rivalry between US and China has probably made our position in relation to New Caledonia slightly timid.
I think it's a nice way to put it. Slightly timid. Feels like a lot of things at the moment. It's very scary. Robert, we're out of time, but thank you very much for joining me. As
You're very
always, I
welcome.
learn so much when I get a chance to sit down and talk to you because you're
Thank
the
you.
expert and I'm just the dumb idiot who collects toys. So thank you very much for that.
You're very welcome. Cheers, Paul.